wala akong
So, kumusta yung experience mo sa The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Pero maganda yung sinabi mo, your imagination was expanded.
Widen siya sa...
Kaya, because you need to, if you're going to do theology, you need to be able to approach theology not just through the intellect, but through the imagination. And so that sometimes that's lacking in a lot of theologizing, where you don't but in the case of C.S. Lewis, he said, everything that I thought is real, I did not like it. Everything that was imaginary, he likes it. Because he approached through myth and through imagination when he was young, and later logic. So the rational, so these two sides, the intellectual, which is logical, rational, and the imaginative, which is through myth and poetry and metaphor. Those two things was actually, parang creating a tension within him. And I think, my theory is, if Lewis did not become a Christian, he might have gone crazy because of the tension. I think in Christ, he found both the imagination and the intellect coming together, because that's how he became a Christian, because he liked he liked Greek mythology. He liked mythology in general. He liked the Greek mythology, but even more than the Greek mythology, he liked the Norse mythology, which is the mythology of the Vikings, the Scandinavian countries, as well as the Irish, kasi Taga-Irish Taga-Ireland C.S. Lewis. Irish, yeah. So, so he got to know that. So once, but he had a problem. He liked the mythology of these Greeks and Scandinavian countries, but he didn't like Jesus. Problem. So Tolkien and he once, they spent some time together. It's called Addison's Walk. So they were walking on Addison's Walk in Oxford, and then they sat near a pond, and then they were discussing about mythology and its importance. So Sabini Tolkien, you're trying when you go to mythology, you're trying to approach, when you read Greek mythology and when you're trying to read Norse mythology, you're approaching it through the imagination, you're approaching it through myth and poetry. But when you come to Jesus Christ, you're using only your intellect. That's why you're turned off, by the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But when you read Adonis, which is also talking about the death and resurrection of Christ, you like it. When you read the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, the death and the resurrection, when you find it in mythology, you like it. But when you find it the same thing in Jesus Christ, you don't like it. How come? Because when you approach the mythology, you're approaching it through imagination, through poetry, through metaphor. When you approach Jesus Christ, it's only through the intellect. That's why you're turned off. What you need to do is you need to approach Jesus Christ as myth. The only difference is it is a true myth. Yeah, so C.S. Lewis has written an article, wonderful article, Myth Became Fact. I think I should make it required reading for doing theology in Asia, because we have so much of mythology. So C.S. Lewis has written a lot. The great thing about C.S. Lewis is, you have people who are myth makers. They write a lot. They create myth. And then there are others who write about myths, But in the case of Lewis, he is both a myth maker and a writer of mythology. So he is able to give both, both worlds, and that's how he became Christian, because of Tolkien. The Tolkien who created Lord of the Rings. you know.
Siya talaga siyang ginamit ng Lord.
Yeah,
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings.
Trilogy.
Yung trilogy. Actually, mas maganda yung Lord of the Rings kesa Narnia. Pero maganda rin yung Narnia. You know, but also C.S. Lewis has written science fiction. Yung Perelandra. Maybe that's the next after Narnia. You should read the Perelandra. Perelandra is Voyage to Venus.
Wow.
It's the most haunting book of Lewis. You know, grabe. You know, it's a wonderful book. And then he's written Perelandra. Yeah. So yeah. Meron din dito. Actually, the only 3 books that is complete, because it's a collection of Lewis. Lewis's books is this much. You know, it's a collection of Lewis. Pero there's only 3 books that is complete.
Kasi
The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Meron kompleto dito. Perelandra may kompleto. Abolition of Man may kompleto. Pero all the other selections lang. You know, kasi he wrote it. Kaya binili ko, di ba, yung a companion to C.S. Lewis. Oh, wow. It's almost complete. But you know, about Lewis, so I was able to buy it 400 pesos. Sabi ni Kuya Boy, when you saw it, sulit ito Sabi niya, when you saw 400 pesos.
Kinuha, pinalikan ko yun, nawala eh.
Siguro siya namatay. Meron din siyang birthday cards.
Oh, yeah, no. Even William Tell. Written about William Tell and things like that. But those are just translations. Pero my theory is, and I haven't tested it, my theory is, kasi today we talk about narrative theology. I mean theology through stories. Yeah, so even ATS just offered one, even Krishnan enrolled. You know, in it, one American program.
Cross-enrolling ng mga
Pwede,
Ayaw na lang yung mga
Pero,
may nagko-cross-enroll from ATS sa klase niya.
kasi si Kuya Boy is ATS professor. Sabi na you enroll ATS, especially Sunil Stephens. Be careful. I don't like seeing these things on camera. But anyway, so because it's like self-promoting. Anyway, but the point I'm trying to say is, we did cross-enroll because I know AGS students have cross-enrolled in AGS. And but AGS India, I think they want that, that open. But anyway, the point is, my theory is that narrative theology, because that, people used to think of, parang when you read the stories in the Bible, parang it's for Sunday school classes, it's for children, it's for cute lessons, from stories. But nobody would go to the stories for theology. Kaya. Pero if you look at the Hebrews, the Jews, when they read. When they read the historical books, what we call historical, they call it the prophetic books. Former prophets, yung Kings, Chronicles, Samuel. So it's prophetic, meaning not prophetic in the sense of foretelling the future, prophetic in the sense that God speaking through history. Yeah, God speaking through history. The voice of God through history. So in other words, you get deep theology through the historical books.
Maganda ma-offer yun sir, no? Under sa theological studies kasi narrative theology.
And that's also one of my interests because I grew up reading Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and we can also use secular books, or even like C.S. Lewis. Pero after 1960s. Because of Lewis and my theory, okay, this is just a theory, that we need to, it has to be tested, the connection. Somebody has to write about the connection and, explore the connection.
I don't shoot.
Binabitin na yun.
Then, tapos na kayo sa
Nag-change costume pa ako, naka-orange ako kanina.
Benatravi.
Ha?
Kay Benatravi. Machamma.
Hindi pa. Kasi I forgot the book na yun. So since you talked about it, I thought I would share. I just share. That's a good thing about Socratic Club. You can talk about, anything. Pero, so I think because of Lewis, where you get deep theology through even children's stories. You see, there was one, So there was one, one father who had backslidden. They say who had backslidden. So he was reading children's stories. He was reading, the Chronicles of Narnia to his kids as bedtime stories. And so while he was reading the story to the kids, he broke down and he cried to the father, and he went back to Christ.
Father
Of his kids. You didn't hear it from me.
Father of?
Yeah, no, the father had backslidden. One father had
one
backslidden.
father.
Yeah, one father had backslidden. Yeah. So, but because he was reading to the kids, bedtime story, the Chronicles of Narnia and C.S. Lewis. So while he was reading it, he broke down and he left, and then he went back to Christ. Because of it. And some kids have said that. That I find Aslan, I'm able to relate to Aslan, but I'm not able to relate to Christ. But these are kids. Just having knows you don't have to worry about it at this moment, But ultimately, if you love Aslan, ultimately it will lead you to Christ. So maganda yun, ganun din yung last battle, which is the seventh in the Chronicles of Narnia. May sabi isang mama sabi niya that I only understood the book of Revelation after reading the last battle.
The story is like
No, it's seven. Last battle, syempre, last battle.
May kapalit daw.
Sabi ko
It's fantasy, fairy tale.
Ate Peones.
Yeah, maganda yun, Pero maganda yung sinasabi mo that it expanded your imagination. Kasi that's what Christians are lacking. Walang metaphor, walang myth, walang poetry in our theology. Pero C.S. Lewis, and since C.S. Lewis, according to Peter Clift, is the most influential Christian writer of the century, and he writes about myth, poetry, metaphor.
Kasi maganda po kay C.S. Lewis, pati mahal si
That is the one that
binabasa
touches.
siya.
That's the one that touches us. So, siguro I rest my case. When people say that. Pero I might have told you the story. Isang Japanese professor who was teaching English literature in a university in Japan, and he. So he was teaching, because he's teaching English literature in the university in Japan. He's teaching, John Milton's Paradise Lost. And then, so one of the great experts of Paradise Lost is a man named Tillyard, in Oxford. Yeah, E.M.W. Tillyard. Tillyard. Pero then C.S. Lewis, who was young, bago lang, he's only a new professor, so he criticizes E.M. Tillyard's view of Milton, C.S. Lewis. So sabi ni the Japanese professor, he said, at that time when I was teaching John Milton, I got news that there was a young man who was challenging Tillyard. For the Japanese professor, Tillyard is the expert. Now he's getting rumors in Japan that there is a young guy who is challenging Tillyard. C.S. Lewis. Okay, so can C.S. Lewis hold a candle against Tillyard? So he started reading Lewis. Sabi niya, the very first page, I was flat. Sabi niya. And then he said, Tillyard doesn't have that magic. And then he says, if only if only theologians would be able to write like Lewis, I would become a fan of theology. He says, I would become a fan of the dry as dust theology. Dry as dust, the otherwise dry as dust theology. You know, Simon, yeah? So in other words, and he said that, you know, and he became a, you know, I think he became later a Christian because he started reading his Christian writings and, you know, and so on.
Japanese history.
Yeah, right, yeah.
We can able to explore the
But in Indian also very read a lot. One guy who was a high school dropout, yung kaibigan ko, he likes reading in India. In fact, there are some books that is made into movies. Sabi niya sa akin, mas maganda yung libro kaysa movie. And he's a high school dropout.
that's
Although Jehovah's Witnesses wala masyadong poetry. Pero in Japanese, they like poetry. That's the thing, not just reading. They like poetry. Kaya Sashiko Endo, by the guy who almost won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he's a Roman Catholic, he's a Christian. He wrote. See, Sashiko Endo, he almost won the Nobel Prize for Literature. That year there were two nominees, both Japanese. The other guy, another guy won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So recently one of his books was made into a movie. Liam Neeson is the one who acted. It's called Silence. We'll be watching it and doing theology. The title of the book is Silence. We'll be watching it and I'll let you know. Because I don't want to show it this Friday, this Thursday, because I want to be there in class when we watch that. But they did not show it in Philippines. Yan ay problema. I mean, some of the good movies don't come to the Philippines. It's only box office. It's only box office hits and things like that. Anyway, this is about the persecution of Japanese Christians in the 17th century. So it's about a true story. It's based on a true, on historical realities. So according to one person, one of the priests, he apostatizes. In other words, he loses his faith. During the persecution. So he loses his faith. This is even before I watched the movie, and I already knew the background of it. So anyway, one father, he gives up his faith, and so two young priests go looking for that senior priest to apostatize because they were his mentor, and so they felt that he could not apostatize because he's so solid in his faith. So they go looking for him, and they go search for him. Finally. So anyway, I don't want to spoil the, but the question is, silence means the silence of God. Where is God? And that's the question that the father who apostatized is asking, where is God when the Japanese are being persecuted in the 17th century?
He's a parang theodicy.
Theodicy and things like that, So he, So anyway, we'll be watching it in our class, Silence, which is made into a movie.
The Silence movie is available on YouTube also.
Wala ata. Kasi it says, you cannot watch it in your country. I got it pirated. 15 pesos. In one of the bridges. But it's good because I already know it. Because sometimes you just watch it, silence, nobody knows about it. And people may not know about it. If it doesn't show here. So anyway, so I... Pwede ka ba? From DVD?
Pwede?
From DVD?
Oo, mga DVD na kukuha dito.
Ano?
Kaya nga nare-reproduce nila dito eh.
Kasi pag nailipat natin sa USB, reproductable.
And then they reproduce.
Anyway,
Kasi bawal sa Pilipinas.
Anyway.
Muhuli nila ako.
Anyway,
Mapahuli.
Shashuko Endo, the great Japanese, the good thing about Shashuko Endo is he's a Christian. He's a Christian and he's a novelist. Kaya that's why, I always encourage my students to read novels, especially novels that have Christian theme, because it is trying to reach to your imagination. Anyway, Shashuko Endo went to Israel. He went to Israel. He did not feel the Spirit of Christ. And then he went to India. Even though India is a Hindu country, there in India he felt the Spirit of Christ. They say because of the spirituality. So he has written a book, a novel. The title of the novel is The River, which is about the Ganges. It talks about 4 Japanese people, who went to India, and they have a past, and because of the past they don't know who they are. They're struggling with their past and the present, and so in India, in different ways they discover themselves. They discover each other.
Sino po
Comment.
who is the...
Shashiko Endo. That's another novel about India. The Japanese going to India, and in India they discover themselves. And spelling of Endo. Shashu. S-H-A. Shashu. S-H. No, S-H-A. Yeah. S-H-A-Q-U. Endo. Yeah, you just type Shashuko.
Endo is the family name.
Endo is the family name.
Pag endo na
E-N-D-O.
lang, end of contract.
Pastor, yung sa internet may question, what country is for you? Tapos, pag ganun po pindot nakalagay, you are very spiritual. The country for you is India.
Parang person test about the person.
Oo.
Sa Facebook.
Sa Facebook. Ang
Ikaw
sabi
din,
niya,
India ka din.
India kasi India daw is
Bawa ng gusto.
for spiritual people.
So anyway, so that's what Shashuko Endo, he discovered Christ and spirituality in India. So he wrote a book in India. Pero this one is silence.
Ang
It's about
conference
the
sa
Japanese
2019 sa
persecution.
Quebec, sa India. Pero I forgot to check kung ano po ng India. May idea ba?
Meron in that's India.
Not South.
South, yes, South.
Okay po.
And then, it's a Muslim city.
Check ko po kung ano ba ng India.
Pero the best biryani is in Hyderabad. The best biryani in India.
Saan yung best bread? Saka dessert.
North India has good bread, South India also. Bread means Indian bread, no?
Chapati.
Yung mga Indian bread.
Yeah, chapati. Chapati, naan, puri, paratha, may klaseng bread. But I want to bring my class to the Little India.
Sa ito niya lang.
Salamat sa iyo, Little India.
Ang gusto ko doon yung ice cream. At saka yung bread. At saka yung bread. Yung bread, yung ice cream nila handmade.
What's the name of the
Kulfi.
Ang pangalan ng ice cream nila, Rose Ice Cream. Tapos sabi ni sister ko, you're going to eat me? I want the rose.
Kaya, my encouragement is read, narrative theology. Read stories, read novels, and some of the Dostoevsky is good. Tolstoy.
Crime and punishment.
Yeah.
Brothers Karamazov?
Brothers Karamazov, pero pwede rin,
Meron na ako nun.
crime and punishment.
Mga PDF.
Meron sa
Mga
maganda
PDF
rin.
na ako. Meron ka na. Sa PDF.
Walker Percy, kasi Catholic si Walker Percy. Percy, P-E-R-C-Y. Yung Catholics are good, Yung short stories ni G.K. Chesterton, maganda rin yung detective stories. You get a lot of...
Kumuha ka ng makapal.
So that's why, Wala Masha, the evangelicals who are good, storytellers. I say usually most of the people I mentioned is either Catholics or Anglicans. C.S. Lewis, Anglican share. Charles Williams, Dorothy Sayers, Lats are Anglican. G.K. Chesterton, Tolkien, Walker Percy, Catholics. Kaya that's a very sad thing. So we need more evangelicals are like, Frank
The one
Perry.
who wrote
Kasi the ones evangelicals, Frank Perry,
The one who wrote
at
the
saka
Rome.
yung Tim LaHaye, Left Behind, Rapture. Michael Perry.
Ay, yung The Rome.
Huh?
The Rome.
A Rome Lutheran siya. That's my point. Yeah, Lutherans, they read. Lloyd Douglas.
White Douglas.
Lloyd Douglas, yeah. They wrote The Robe. Meron din movie, Richard Burton ata.
Ay, yung Pontius Pilate.
Paul Meyer. Paul Meyer, historian. Lutheran din. Yan. Hi. Welcome. Yeah, you guys.
Welcome to the jungle. Oh Maya.
Paul Meyer. P-A-U. He has two books.
Holland.
Holland.
Yeah, Netherlands.
Netherlands.
From Amsterdam.
I'm not from Amsterdam.
Which part?
The middle. Oblak, a small village.
Holland, that's a place for tulips.
Yeah.
Yeah, Holland too. That's
And
why you have-
cheese, the best.
Cheese, yeah. Thank you.
I did that at the airport.
Cheese, yeah.
Only the airport.
Only in
You've been on the airport?
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
And Pontius
Tulips,
Pilate.
cheese, and wooden shoes. Yeah.
My bag, Amsterdam. Amsterdam.
I see, nice.
We started here.
Are you also studying at ATS?
Which made Amsterdam?
We went like this.
Yes, but it is, the first week I was here, I took the same course.
Yung
One course.
Are you on
Opo.
in Quezon?
Not yet, but I
You
will
took
move
a
to
taxi
Quezon
from
province, yeah.
Better girl.
They will, yeah, they are ways,
Even though taxi knows, they also better.
No, we joke, but this is
Especially
the
if you're
son of
foreigner.
pastor, we can but say no.
Last time we got in there like extra. We got extra. I don't know. Sorry, go on.
No, I was talking about narrative theology because he just read C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I was telling him, that maybe it's interesting. I think because now narrative theology, even in the West, it's become very important. But like in Hinduism and other religions, it's always been narrative theology, Mahabharata, and all that. So but in the West, they always felt that stories are only good for Sunday school kids. You get cute lessons for Sunday school kids, so they don't usually go to stories for theology. But since C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and since Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I think the narrative theology has become important even in the West. So usually, before that, people used to go to Paul for theology, and for Luke, let's say, to look for stories. Yeah, and they don't see the connection between the two. You want theology? Read Paul. You want stories? Read Luke. So, that has been the usual, the usual thing. But then in the 1970s, Howard Marshall, the New Testament theologian, he wrote a book. Very small book. The title of the book is Luke, Historian or Theologian, and his answer is both. So you get theology through stories, and so deep theology of stories, and that's what we can learn from the Jews. For the Jews, when you look at the Old Testament, the Jews call what we call historical books, like Kings and First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. We call it the historical books. the Jews call it the former prophets. You know, so they divide the books into former prophets and latter prophets. You know, the former prophets are, you know, what you got is like Joshua, you know, Judges, which would be one book, and then your First and Second Kings, which would be one book, and then your First and Second Chronicles, which would be one book, and then your First and Second, Samuel, which would be one book.
Why did we separate that?
Yeah, we separated it into two books, but the Jews, you know, they would have it, you know, they would have less books because they see it as a continuation.
But why do we have two books?
Yeah, you know,
Why
yeah,
don't
we
have one?
right, we separated. Actually, in the beginning, you don't even have chapters. In the Jewish Bible, you don't have chapters, you don't have verses. So we, you know, have separated chapters, and sometimes the chapters are funny. You know, it doesn't. It seems like they're cut it at a place where they should not. You know, where they should not cut. You know, and so yeah. So I think that's where. So the Jewish way of looking at things can help us. So when they say former prophets, they don't mean foretelling, like, you know, prophesying, eschatology. You know, what we mean by prophecy. You know, what they mean by prophecy is God speaking, God's voice speaking to us through history. You know, so that's what. So therefore, by the very meaning of prophet, the former prophets, and then the latter prophets are again 4 books. You know, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then all the 12 minor prophets would be one book. You know, so that would make it, you know, so that would make it 4, you know, that would make it 4 books. So former prophets, latter prophets, 4 of each. So a total of 8, total of 8 books. So I think we can learn from them the idea that God speaks through, you can get deep theology through stories. And so here again, you know, when you read parables and stuff like that, one of the things, you know, about parables or the stories in the New Testament, for example, is the stories are subversive. You know, and that's, you know, because sometimes usually when you think of stories, you know, you think of stories as something that is nice and cute, you know, for kids and for bedtime. But the stories, you know, is as subversive. All the stories of Jesus goes against the establishment. Take the parable of the prodigal son. We don't have time to look at it now. But if you look at the parable of the prodigal son, at every step, the people who are listening to it, including the disciples, will be shocked. For us, you know, we know the story, we know the ending, and we say, yes, it's nice, it's wonderful, it talks about God's love and things like that. But the people who first heard it, they would be shocked, you know, by the story. At every point, you know, they would be shocked. That's what I mean by subversive. You know, so the parable, one of the features of the parables in particular is that it is subversive. It goes against the establishment, goes against the status quo, it challenges, you know, the people, you know, makes them think at the end in a way that is different. You know, so the idea of stories, so one of the things about the stories is that it is a powerful tool in challenging the way we think and challenging the way we imagine. You know, so it's, again, so to summarize, stories are through imagination. You know, it's not just through the intellect. Theology can sometimes be only through the intellect. The stories touches to the whole person. And that is why C.S. Lewis had a problem. You know, when he looked at the mythology of Greece or Norse, he liked it. But when he looked at Jesus Christ, he didn't like it. You know, it kind of turned him off. You know, and then it was Tolkien, the one who wrote The Lord of the Rings, who explained to himself. Because when you read when you read Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology or Norse mythology, and when you read of a dying god and a god who rises from the dead, you like it because it's myth, it's through the imagination. But when you read Jesus Christ, you're only using your intellect. You know, you're using your reason only and your rationality, and that's where you're turned off. But Jesus Christ dying and rising from the dead is also a myth. The only difference is it is a true myth. You know, so C.S. Lewis says myth. C.S. Lewis says myth becomes fact. You know, And he's written a beautiful essay on mythology. And I think that's why Asians are one of the reasons why Asians like C.S. Lewis is that even though he's never been to Asia, but Asia is a land of myth, and metaphor and poetry. That's one of the reasons why they find him attractive. And I'll just close with this one example. Paul Clasper, he's written a book called Eastern Paths and Western Thought or something. And something like that, I don't know the exact title. But Paul Clasper was a missionary in Asia, in Myanmar for a while and then in Hong Kong. So he used to work among the Chinese for a long time. So once he was invited to speak in a Chinese seminary next to the University of Hong Kong, in Hong Kong. And so he came to speak, and he was going to speak on gospel and culture. And then while he was speaking gospel and culture, during question and answer time, all the students had great insight into the relationship between gospel and culture. And so Paul Clasper was impressed, and so he asked the students, Chinese students, don't forget that, Chinese students, who grew up in China, Chinese way of thinking in Hong Kong. So he asked them, he said, I'm impressed by your understanding between gospel and culture. And then he asked them, who influenced you the most in your understanding between the relationship between gospel and culture? And all of them said C.S. Lewis. Paul Clasper couldn't believe it. Here is a man who has never been to Asia, but because, because he said, that there's two things within him, the rationality, because very logical. If you read his Miracles and Problem of Pain, very logical. If you read his other books, very imaginative. And he says, everything that was real, I didn't like. Everything that was imaginary, I loved it. And he said, so then as he was growing up, the tension between that which is real and that which is imaginary. And although C.S. Lewis doesn't say it, I think that if it wasn't for Christ, he would have become crazy. He would have become a split personality. I think it was in Christ, both the intellect and the imagination was resolved. The tension was resolved. And unfortunately, we don't use the imagination a lot. And Lewis can help us. To Asians, he wants us to use the, rational. To the West, who are rational, he wants them to use the imagination. So he touches both the West and the East. At the very point. That's why I think Peter Crick calls him the most influential, writer of the 20th century. I just told you before they came, I told you about the Japanese guy who became a Christian because of he was a Japanese professor of English literature. So if you want to know the story, you watch the video. I'm just kidding. It's very important.
Cross test all things. You can subscribe.
Oh yeah, definitely. I just have to type that.
Cross test all things.
Both for the Socratic Club
Socratic and the PBF.
So all that I missed so far I can scatter.
That's right.
It's a YouTube channel. The Cross Test All Things Ministry.
Anyway, nice to have you also. This is Socratic Club. We meet about 5:15 and we discuss anything under the sun. Like Socrates, yeah.
I went back to reality today.
Okay.
Today, the first day of my work.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Back to school.
I did my, ang dami ko ginawa.
Back to reality. Congratulations. You are alive again.
Anyway, I'm done.
She's
Any questions or any comments?
university professor.
We still have 5 minutes.
Yeah, it is interesting. Even being from the Asian culture, loving stories, and having experienced Christendom as to what I thought it was.
Right.
You often feel like there's a lot missing here.
Right, yeah.
But after coming here, a lot of that is coming back, and I'm starting to grasp Christ and the understanding of the world in a more holistic manner, it really gives that spark to that color that you thought always in this.
After coming to PBF,
After coming to PBF, ATS, everything.
Although you have it in India too, people sometimes Christianity, you know, can
It's
get
influence,
isolated,
Western
Western influence, yeah.
Because wherever you go, whatever denomination you're part of, you see that Western influence still represent trained by those establishments.
in India,
Because when I was working at a Christian organization, we were sharing the. I used to work for a Christian organization that came from the West, and we were trained to share the gospel in 10 minutes.
Campus
You know,
Hussein.
that's okay. But there were guys who used to traveling itinerary preachers, who were the Christians, evangelists, who wear the Hindu dress, saffron robe, and they go, they call it Katha Kalashebam, which means, stories in the form of a drama, and then, so they tell stories, stories interspersed with songs, and, so they tell the stories from Genesis to Jesus Christ, to the death and resurrection of Christ, through stories and through poetry and through music. And and at that time, because I was trained in the Western way, I used to look down upon them. But later, I found that, they knew something that I did not know. At that time, and I was proud of my ignorance. And so, but this guy knew something very Indian. It's in the form of because in India, you can listen to the Mahabharata 9 nights, every night. It's a drama that goes on and on. So now there are people who try to come up with a Jesus story, like the Bhagavad Gita or the Mahabharata, but not evangelicals. It's usually Catholics.
Makes sense.
Mainstream. Evangelicals are still propositional.
Yeah, having said that, and adding to narrative theology, we just took up a course in ATS called Simply the Story.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Learning the art of storytelling through the narrative bits in the back. And I was like, whoa. Just in the beginning, I was like, what? I have 90 credits to finish in my end. On top of that, Serge was just like, why don't you take this also? And it's not even there in my lesson. I'm like, really? You want me to learn another subject? But after I went, it was very humbling. I didn't have a lot, which I just, I'm glad I went for it.
So when you read stories, that's why people like Dostoevsky, that's why you read novels. So novels can help you understand, not just Christian novels, but Christian writers, even secular writers, they know the art of storytelling. So even William Faulkner, who's an agnostic, but you read Moby Dick, agnostic, but God intoxicated agnostic. And if you could use a contradictory phrase, you come to, blessed is the person who comes to the Bible, with his mind saturated with the humanities. Who says this? Calvin. John Calvin. Wow, so, you won't expect this usually from Calvin. You think he's a theologian. But John Calvin said, blessed is the person who comes to the Bible with his mind saturated with the humanities. By humanities, he means literature, arts, and so on, poetry and things like that.
time na yun. Hindi nung time panahon ko. First 2 years.
So read novels. I just mentioned one Japanese novelist, Christian novelist, Shashuko Endo. But then those who studied in my class, you get theology from Dostoevsky, who is a novelist, Tolstoy, who is a Christian novelist.
Oo nga.
Hanggang ngayon,
Saan man dito?
But evangelicals are not good with novels.
blessed is the person.
C.S. Lewis is not an evangelical, he's an Anglican. Most of the names I gave you are Catholics or Anglicans. Like Tolkien is Anglican.
Catholic.
Catholic. Tolkien is Catholic. Lewis is Anglican. Walker Percy is Catholic. G.K. Chesterton is Catholic. Dorothy Sayers, Charles Williams, all Anglicans. We don't have Shashuko Endo, the Japanese Christian writer, is Catholic. I mean, he almost won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He just missed
Sir
it.
Rizal,
But
itinapulong
his life was changed when he went to India.
Christian siya, Sir Rizal.
He went to Israel. He didn't see the spirit of Christ. He goes to India. He sees the spirit of Christ. So he wrote a novel, which, as an Indian, maybe you should read it. You know, the novel is The River. That's about 4 Japanese who goes
May
to
movie
India.
na English na The
Ganges.
River, iba
The
naman
river
yun.
is called the Ganges.
The River. Iba naman yun.
Bend. The river bend of the river. The river Indian also,
American.
Indian.
Pati yung mga films na Indian.
French who made in India.
His name, Pastor?
Shashuko Endo. Shashaku. Shashuko Endo, last name, E-N-D-O. So one way to cultivate narrative theology is to read stories.
Ay, yan pala yung sa'yo.
Ba
Kala
yan?
ko, oo. Somebody's calling you.
Ayan. Ay,
Baka sila eh.
hindi, this is message, not text. Wala na siya. Ano ba ito? Algebra.
Kaya, call ba yun?
Text lang, ha?
Dapat ang haba. Kanina pa kanta ng kanta.
Basta nasagot eh.
Akala ko nga sa
Baka,
kabila.
kasi
Second line, Ellie is the one, she said,
Nag-delay. Diyan lang nakatira si Teacher Dayan. Doon lang kami sa...
Whose mind is filled with the-
Edgar.
Like John Calvin, what was that last name?
blessed is the person who comes to the Bible with his mind saturated with humanity. Sige, tapos na.
Hindi na magpe-pray.
Kahit concentrate. Concentrate daw.
Pastor, please pray for me because this Saturday,
Uy,
I am representing UP Manila Toastmasters in a contest, humorous speech contest, but I have the title, I don't have the speech yet, and it's
kailan yan?
Saturday in
This-
Binondo. My topic is me and my big mouth. I will make people laugh, but actually it will be my lessons on being tactless. And the moral of the story is be careful what you say. So I haven't written my speech. I'm supposed to finish writing it tonight.
Okay, for the famous speech.
And then I have a research to make, incoming research, Philippine Burmese religions.
Burmese religions.
Philippine and Myanmar relations. I was asked to choose between Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. Eh, sabi ko Myanmar kasi may matatanong ako dito. Laos, my contact person left. Cambodia, my contact person left.
That's nice. Okay. That's nice.
But I will be starting because I don't know anything. My friend just got me to help her with her research because I know how to write it.
You can start dating, something in...
What's her name? Ellie was bit by a dog.
Oh,
So she had to take, so she had to take some injections.
Right now?
With yesterday, so she feels the body
Yung
is
sinasya namin.
so both of them will be here.
She's okay?
Yeah, she said, according to her, she said it's not much, but they were bleeding. That was the day, remember they were saying they were going to see the Lebanese? Yeah, so I think it was in the restaurant. Yeah, at the Lebanese.
The only Lebanese place you hear them mentioning all the time is Meshwi. That's also
yeah, but they went to...
Malinga.
Di ba they went
That's also
first
Malinga. They dropped us in the
Spania?
They went to Manila.
Meshwi is in Malinga.
No, there's one in Fairview.
Maginhawa.
No, the Fairview one.
Malinaw is just
Manila is just an extension. The real one is in Fairview.
But they went to Spania first.
Sige na, let's
To
pray.
pick up.
Lord, we commit Ellie into your hands. We pray for healing for her, Lord. Father, we pray that as we try to look at theological stories, Lord, the way it can challenge the living thing and challenge the status quo, go against the system and the establishment, or even stories like power, quality of faith, he will be able to emphasize narrative theology, especially in Asia.